Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 304 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. For those of us who live outside of Texas, Juneteenth may seem like a new holiday that we hear about each June. The actual day of Juneteenth is June 19th. It's a state holiday that originated in Texas, and a day that's starting to become a state holiday in many other states as well. So what exactly is Juneteenth? Juneteenth is a day that commemorates the end of slavery in Texas specifically, and more broadly, the end of slavery in the United States. Annette Gordon-Reed is an award-winning historian at Harvard University, best known for her work on the Hemings family and Thomas Jefferson. Annette is also a native Texan. She's someone who grew up in East and Gulf Coast Texas, and she recently wrote a reflective book on her experiences called On Juneteenth. It's a book that discusses and investigates the history of Texas and its Juneteenth holiday. Now, during our discussion with Annette, she reveals information about Texas's early history as a colony and as an independent republic, details about Texas's history with and use of slavery, and the origins of the Juneteenth holiday, and why there is a movement to make this Texas state holiday a commemorative day throughout the United States. But first, have you checked out the new Ben Franklin's World swag shop yet? We've moved our store over to TeePublic, so we're now able to offer you all sorts of Ben Franklin's World swag. Swag like t-shirts, tote bags, mugs, stickers, notebooks, and so much more. You should check it out at benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Now, each purchase you make from benfranklinsworld.com/shop helps generate funds that support this podcast. So you can feel great about any purchase you make. To check it out, visit benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Okay, are you ready to explore the early history of Texas and its famous state holiday? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a Carl M. Loeb University professor and a professor of history at Harvard University and Harvard Law School. Her books have won 16 major awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in History and the National Book Award. She's known for her expertise on the Hemings family and Thomas Jefferson, but she joins us today as a native Texan, who will speak with us about her newest book, On Juneteenth. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Annette Gordon-Reed.
Glad to be here.
You know, I really feel like I should start this conversation here with a disclaimer that I've had this really weird fascination with Texas since about the 5th grade.
Why?
Well, it's a really good question, but I really think my fascination has to do with the fact that I grew up in the 5th and 6th smallest states in the Union, Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And, Texas is a really big state. It's the second biggest state in the United States.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, well, speaking of Texas, your new book, On Juneteenth, is actually a really different kind of history book than we've seen before or talked about on the show, in that it's really a book of historical essays that not only explore the history of Texas and its famous holiday Juneteenth, but also your personal connection with Texas and Juneteenth as a native Texan. So I'd really like for us to begin with having you tell us a bit about your book and what inspired you as a historian of early America to delve into the history of Texas.
Well, my editor, Bob Weil at Live Right, he was the editor of my book, The Hemings of Monticello, has been after me for a number of years to write a book about Texas. But I think he wanted a big book about Texas. And I had sort of not resisted that, but it was something that I was sort of putting off. And then I decided, after I did an essay, I was asked to do an essay for The New Yorker about Juneteenth. And I did. And that got me thinking a lot about my past and thinking maybe I would like to do an essay, maybe a longer one or a different one that talked about another aspect of Texas history through my family. And my editor said, you should do a book, a small book that is sort of a combination of memoir and history, as you've wanted to do. And so that's what got me started. And we were in the pandemic here in New York, locked down, and I decided to go to work on it. So it was a combination of something that I'd been thinking about doing. I actually, as I was cleaning out a closet, found an essay that pretty much is a precursor to the essay that I wrote about growing up in my small town. And that must have been 10 or 12 years ago when I wrote that. It was sort of interesting to see what I kept and what I didn't keep, what I remembered and what I didn't between those two. So it's something I've been thinking about, tossing around in my head for a while, but just came to a head when I was here in New York with not much else to do over the summer.
Sure. And, another thing I think we should state here is that you're not just a native-born Texan. Your family really has long and deep roots in the Lone Star State, too.
Yes. From doing some research, I was able to determine that on my mother's side, one of her lines has been in Texas at least since the 1820s. And on my father's side, it would be the 1840s and the 1850s. So we're not Johnny-come-latelys to this place. And most of my family is still there. So it's a pretty deep legacy in this place, this very interesting place. And so I just wanted to sort of talk about our family history, sort of interwoven with the history of Texas overall.
And that's one of the things I found really fascinating about your work because, historians don't usually make history personal. So I wonder what that experience was like for you to talk about the personal with the events of Texas history.
Well, that is interesting because we usually try to stand outside of history and we're writing about things that are, for the most part, don't have a real connection to us, a personal connection to us. It was the kind of writing that I've wanted to do. I always wanted to be a writer growing up, and I envisioned myself writing essays and maybe short stories, things of that nature. And you don't really get a chance to do that very much with history. I've gone down a different road with that. But it was fun at some level, some sort of trepidation. My co-author, Peter Onuf, read the manuscript and he said, well, you're very personal here in an Annette Gordon Reedy kind of way. And what he meant was it's personal, but it's not, I'm not spilling, everything in this, but it is talking about myself in a way that I don't typically do. So it was kind of refreshing, actually, to be freed from that. There are no endnotes in it. I have at the back of the book a list of the sources that I consulted for special things, but I felt freer doing it this way as opposed to the typical way of endnoting every little thing, footnoting every little thing, and trying to be objective. You don't have to be objective because I'm describing what I thought about these things, and that's perfectly legitimate.
Now, did being so personal with Texas help you come to any realizations about the state or any better understandings of Texas and its history?
Well, it made me think about how Texas has been presented to the world. And I was required to do a little bit of this when I was working on the essay for the New Yorker. And Texas has an image, and the image doesn't really fit some of the stark realities of the place. I say in the book, Texas has been constructed as a white man, essentially. And that's not what everybody is there. What does it mean to live in a place where everybody sees an image, the cowboy, West Texas, deserts? I talk about a classmate of mine at Dartmouth who asked me my freshman year, how far did I live from the desert? What was it like living, near a desert? If you look at a map of Texas, the eastern part is just green. It's a big pine forest, essentially, that you could fit New England into. Most of New England into. And then the western part is dry and a desert. But I'd never been to the deserts of West Texas. Cowboys are in West Texas. They're all over Texas, but that's mainly a West Texas sort of thing. So was trying to think of what it's like to live in a place where there's an image of the place, but a different reality. And Texas was a plantation society. It's closer to East Texas, to Louisiana and Mississippi and that whole thing than cowboys. And that has been forgotten because I think the cowboys, that's a much more palatable story than enslavers and plantations and slavery and all of that. People don't want to be reminded of that. And there's an easy out for Texans because you can talk about the cowboy or oil man, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I'd really like to talk about some of these misunderstandings about Texas, because one of my favorite lines in your book, On Juneteenth, is that there's just so much to misunderstand about Texas. So, Annette, could you tell us about non-cowboy Texas, like you just told us about, and what else there is to misunderstand about the state and its history?
Well, the primary one is that Stephen F. Austin, who is considered the father of Texas, brought the first settlers to Texas, first big settlements to Texas, and fully expected it to be a slave economy, a slave society, because he knew that people coming from Mississippi and Alabama and those places, they weren't going to come if they didn't have an assurance that their property rights in enslaved people would be protected. That was somewhat in doubt because the Mexican government was opposed to slavery. I mean, they turned a blind eye to its practice and they abolished slavery. But there was always a fear that they were actually going to enforce that and become much more serious about it. And so there was always this tension between the early settlers and the government that they were living under. And eventually they break away, of course, and that becomes the source of a great amount of pride in Texas, that Texas was a republic, that it was its own country for a time. And we don't really think about why it became it. Now, it's true, there were federalism issues involved in this. I mean, Santa Anna did suspend the Constitution, but there was also fear about the question of slavery. And they wanted no doubt about that because there had been huge investments in it and there were property rights. So remember the Alamo and remember Goliad and all of those things have bigger legacies there because they were fighting to maintain a republic or to create a republic in which slavery would be a safe system for them.
Could you tell us a bit more about the pre-United States history of Texas? You just mentioned Mexico and Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And, in addition to thinking of Texas as a slave state, I think we also need to remember that prior to American settlement, Texas was also a Spanish colony and a part of Mexico. So would you provide us with a short overview of the early history of Texas and when slavery came to Texas?
We take Texas history twice growing up. The Spanish explorers came to Texas in the 1500s. I began the book talking about Cabeza de Vaca and a group of Spaniards who originally wanted to go to the area of Florida, but Florida and Cuba as well. But a hurricane came and destroyed their ship and everything. And they basically came across the Gulf of Mexico and landed in Texas. And with them was a man named Estebanico, who was an enslaved man. And they end up eventually walking from Texas to Mexico over towards California. And for a time, they had been enslaved by some of the indigenous people who were there. That's one thing about the book that I do want to say is that I wanted to try to write about every group that was a part of it. And certainly the indigenous people were a part of Texas before the Spaniards came. Some groups that no longer exist that were supplanted by the Apache and the Comanche later on, which are the two groups of people that most people know in Texas, about Texas. So this is a place where Native peoples were coming into contact with Spaniards all along from Texas down through Mexico, Central America. And it's a part of that whole region that was Spanish, essentially. And from there, we have the loss of Native American peoples. There were displacement of Native American people. And Anglos beginning to trickle into Texas in the 1700s and mainly in the 1800s, and begins to take off in the 1820s with Stephen F. Austin and his goal of sort of having Anglo settlement in this place. And the Spanish welcomed them because they were concerned about Comanche raids and they wanted someone to balance the tension out. Texans, people came and they were prosperous and they were making their way there and cooperation with the Spanish until they got to this point where they were concerned about slavery. And Santa Anna was, as I said, threatening them because he suspended the Constitution and they didn't think that they could be safe under that system. So it's always a rough place. It's a frontier society. And I compare it to Virginia. All of the kinds of stuff that was happening in Virginia in the early 1600s, Texas is there in the 1820s and 1830s. This is kind of very rough place and brooking no qualms whatsoever about slavery, apparently. And that was the thing that made it a controversial place with annexation into the Union in the 1840s, because it was unabashedly a slaveholders' republic. And they made no bones about that.
So what exactly was the allure of Texas for Anglo-Americans? It's not necessarily a place when they go to settle there where slavery is legal, so why do they want to settle in Texas?
Land. I mean, fueling the plantation economy, cotton. The land is good for growing cotton. It's good for growing sugarcane. Later on, now, I mean, it's huge agricultural space, rice, all those kinds of things. But cotton is part of the cotton kingdom. And Galveston was an important port, and you could ship goods out from Galveston. So it was situated well for farmland and for trade, international trade, because of the port there at Galveston Island.
Now, I'd like to go back to East Texas. You mentioned earlier that East Texas has this large pine forest that you could really fit most of New England within it. And, like your friend from New Hampshire, I also thought about Texas as having this hot and arid and desert-like climate. So I wonder if you could set the record straight for us and tell us more about East Texas and why you refer to it as, quote, an environmental arc, end quote, in your book On Juneteenth.
Yes. The Big Thicket covers huge regions of East Texas. Pine trees. The Piney Woods is a section of the area where I grew up in Conroe and Livingston, part of the Big Thicket. Incredibly diverse in terms of wildlife and birds and so forth. It's very lush. Where I live, too, it's so funny. Before I was working on this book, I always thought, I say I'm from East Texas. And I am from East Texas, but the region that I actually live in I was born in proper East Texas, but where I grew up, 50 miles south, is part of the Gulf Coast region. And that is an area where there are hurricanes. By the time they get up to us, they've been over land, and unless it's an incredibly strong one, they've somewhat dissipated. But it's humid. It's a tropical climate. And you just don't think of that when you think of Texas, because as you're saying, you think of the desert and a place of farmers, cotton farmers, and oil. The first oil strikes. Again, we think of oil, we think of West Texas primarily, and the Bushes and Permian Basin and so forth. But the first oil strikes in Texas were at Spindletop, which is in East Texas, which is about 70 miles away from where I grew up. And Exxon had its start there as part of the Humble Oil Company, and then mixed with Standard Oil. And then when they broke them up, then they came back together after being broken up into ExxonMobil. So it's oil, timber. The other thing, I mean, lumberjacks, my grandfather and his fathers, that's how they made their money. My great-grandfather, after coming out of slavery, he and his brothers bought some land in East Texas, and they cut and sold timber off of it. They were essentially lumberjacks. So it's not at all the picture of the barren Texas that you think of. It's a forest, and very lush and very hot and humid.
So we really are talking about an area and a climate that's really well suited for plantations.
Yes, absolutely. But you needed somebody to clear the land. I mean, that's what was so important to people coming from Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and all those places. You come into the Big Thicket, and somebody had to clear that land, and enslaved people did that and planted cotton and planted sugarcane, which is, as I'm sure you probably know, a very, very tough crop for people. So it was a harsh environment for enslaved people.
So Texans really needed enslaved people to clear the land and to grow these labor-intensive crops of cotton and sugar. So I wonder if you could tell us more about the practice of slavery in Texas. Because we know from other episodes how slavery was practiced in the Southeast and in Louisiana and some of the Caribbean islands like Jamaica, where they predominantly grew sugarcane. But I wonder if there was anything that was similar or different in the practice of slavery in these other places as compared to the practice of slavery in Texas. So did Texas differ in its practice of slavery in any way?
I don't think there's much of a, to the extent that when you went further west, if there were cattle, there would be more cattle, that blacks were involved in herding cattle and working with cattle. But East Texas is essentially Louisiana, spread out, and all the things you'd expect to find there, except the French part of it, right? The French influence is not there, although there was Six Flags over Texas. I mean, France had some dealings there for a time, but it's essentially the Deep South. And that's the tough thing for people to recognize. Texas is Southwest, but the West part of it gets emphasized much more. But a lot in common with Louisiana. The community property marriage is in Texas and Louisiana. And there's a lot of flowing back and forth between East Texas and Louisiana. When I stayed at my grandmother's house, very often, sometimes visiting ministers from other places would come and stay with her. And very often these people were from Louisiana because they would be going to the circuit, and Cajuns, Acadian people who came down to Louisiana from Canada. So it's very much like a plantation society, but you just don't think of it that way. And I tell you, growing up, it's different now. When I was growing up, I very seldom saw Confederate flags. I recall there was one at the courthouse. I think there was one when I was a very little girl, but then they replaced that. It was the Texas flag is everywhere. But now, and I think this is a political thing, the last time I was there and driving around a lot, I saw more Confederate flags than I've seen in my entire life there. It was always the Texas flag and the American flag. But I think the politics of the lost cause and the Old South have come back, and it has a bigger role to play, even though Texas was part of the Confederacy, obviously. But I think people emphasize the Republic, the notion of the Lone Star Republic held sway when I was growing up, much more than the Confederate flag.
That's really interesting. And I wonder if you would continue this thought a bit more and tell us about the Republic of Texas. How did Texas come to be an independent nation, albeit a briefly lived one?
Well, it formed in opposition to try to make the claim that it was very much like the United States of America. They had a Declaration of Independence that I say is basically sort of a ripoff of Jefferson's Declaration without the part about all men are created equal. They left that part out. The Constitution, essentially prohibits, any Black people from coming there. It protected slavery. And it's like the later Confederate Constitution. Any concerns people had about the possibility of a government being able to interfere with it, they nixed that and basically say the only Black people who could be in Texas were enslaved Black people, the property of people. They couldn't come, they couldn't migrate there. And again, what do you do with that if you're growing up and you have a very positive story told about the Texas Republic and the idea that Texas is free? If you actually look at the documents, then you're like, I don't know. I'm not on board with that kind of thing. So you have to figure out some way, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, of dealing with the history, but holding the mythology sort of at arm's length, because there's no way for a non-crazy Black person to be nostalgic for a republic that we couldn't have lived in, or we could only have been enslaved in. So I'm interested to see how people respond to the book, because I was reading the other day that there's something called the 1836 Project down in Texas now, where I guess taking off from the 1619 Project. But the idea is to focus on the history of Texas as a republic. And they say that they're going to deal with everything, even Juneteenth in it. But I wonder how they're going to play it, because if you're telling the truth about it, those are some pretty rough customers. And it was a white supremacist society. It just was. There's no way around it. It's not even like, the American Constitution, they're sort of tiptoeing around slavery, persons held to service, or all men are created equal, and you could play with that. But there's nothing here. They're saying no Black people can come here, and, slavery is okay, and blah, blah, blah. So it's going to be a rough time to turn that to any kind of hagiography of that period.
Now, speaking of frames through which to view Black history, you note in your book, On Juneteenth, that the history of slavery in North America and the history of African America look very different when we don't view it through a British or an American lens. Now, right now, we need to take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. But when we're done, I'd like for us to talk more about what the histories of slavery in African America look like in early Texas when we don't have a British or early United States lens to view slavery through. As I mentioned at the start, I have had a fascination with Texas since about the 5th grade. My fascination started with the need to write a school report about a state that was not my own. So since I couldn't write about New Hampshire, I chose to write about Texas. And wow, I found out then what an interesting place Texas is. I mean, first of all, it is a big state. It's part of several different American regions, and it has this rich and fascinating past. Which is why I'm really glad we have a chance to explore some Texas history today, and that our episode sponsor, BetterHelp, has helped to make this exploration of history possible. Now, if you're not familiar with BetterHelp, BetterHelp is an affordable professional counseling service done securely online. If something is interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals, BetterHelp can help you by assessing your needs and matching you with your own licensed professional therapist. Once you're matched, you can message your counselor at any time. And if you don't like your counselor for any reason, BetterHelp is committed to helping you find the right match, free of charge. BetterHelp's licensed professional counselors are people who specialize in helping with depression, stress and anxiety, relationships, sleep, trauma, anger, family conflicts, and so much more. Anything you share with your counselor is confidential. And have I mentioned how this service is convenient because it's done entirely online? Start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting BetterHelp at betterhelp.com/BenFranklin. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health. Again, visit betterhelp.com/BenFranklin. Annette, given Texas's strong views of race, what does the history of slavery in African America look like in early Texas, where we don't have a British or early United States lens in which to view slavery and race?
Well, what I talk about in the book is that Estebanico, I fixate on Estebanico as the person who's probably the first Black person of African descent, as far as we know, who set foot in Texas. But I also talk about St. Augustine, which is in Florida, and it's still the Spanish, all in that general area there, who had Black people in Florida in the 1530s, and later on have a settlement that's 1695 that is for enslaved Blacks who flee from Virginia, the Carolinas mainly, into it. And not because the king of Spain was an abolitionist or anything, but it was sort of destabilizing part of the competition with the English. And what I say in the book is that I appreciate the idea of the 20 and odd Negroes who were brought to Virginia in 1619, but there have been Black people there much longer. And I think it's sort of odd that the sort of boundaries that Europeans made of their country and the competition that they had sets our understanding of the history of Black people. Because, you know, whether you spoke Spanish, whether you spoke French, whether you spoke English, what they had in common was that they had been enmeshed in the African slave trade and slavery and white supremacy, living under white supremacy. So it doesn't make any sense. Just because the Spanish lost and the English won doesn't mean that Black people should not think they had any connection to those people enslaved in Florida and Estebanico, and the enslaved people who were brought over with the Spanish in Mexico and Central America and all these other places. Because one of the books that I used, Andre Resendez's book, A World So Strange, that talked about Black people who were brought over who left the Spanish expeditions and sometimes went out into Mexico, had their own kind of quests, not a great thing, but they were doing different things. To talk just about 20 and odd Negroes who come and then all of a sudden we have plantation slavery doesn't really get at the fact that people of African descent were all over the world, and they were all over the New World doing all different kinds of things. And so I just think it would make people think differently about African people and their place in the world and their experiences in the world. It means something if you don't just fixate on the English, and the English did this. It's almost as if Black people, African Americans, are creatures of the English and created by them. But no, there are lots of different experiences that we've had that people need to know about. And that's just in a very short book. One of the things that I wanted to raise is to look beyond that.
Those are really interesting points in it. And I wonder, when people think about the history and contributions of African and African American people in North America, is there anything in particular that they should think about, or a way that they can change and broaden their view of the history of Black and African America to include the examples of Estebanico and St. Augustine and the other examples you mentioned?
the notion of creative people. I mean, Estebanico, I make the point, was the translator for the Spanish and the native peoples that they encountered. He evidently was said to have had a great facility with languages. And, the image of people relying on a person of African descent to communicate between two, different cultures, it says something about capacity. I mean, obviously, the notions about white supremacy have emphasized incapacity, people who were not trustworthy, people who could not learn, who could not do things. So to the extent that you see people doing lots of different things, other things that you don't expect, it changes your attitudes about them. And it also, I think, drives home, as if it needed to be, even more the horror of slavery, that people who were capable, who did do lots of things, were treated as if they were incapable and that they were not worthy. And so it's a bigger picture of the people, but it sort of reinforces the problem with the institution of chattel slavery.
Now, jumping from the 1500s to the 1800s, actually, I'd like to go more than 350 years down the timeline of history here. If we come to 1865, we find that Texas joined and fought for the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And that in 1865, the Confederate States, including Texas, have surrendered to the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
Annette, could you set the scene for us here about what post-Civil War Texas looked like and what happened on June 19, 1865?
Well, Gordon Granger is the person who read General Order 3 that announced the end of slavery in Texas on June 19th, had been in Louisiana, and he was ordered over to Galveston to deliver, this particular news. It was clear he was going to be doing this. And in fact, people had heard, as they say, through the grapevine, that something like this was going to happen. And so he comes to Galveston, and the first thing he does is write out this order. And there are differing stories about how this was disseminated. There's one story that says he stood on the balcony of the villa where he was staying, they'd requisitioned, taken over, and read it. There are other stories that the soldiers went through Galveston reading the proclamation. Galveston was the most important city in Texas at that time. I mean, it's the port, the big port. And both things probably happened. It didn't have to be any one thing. I mean, it would make sense if his soldiers, and there were Black soldiers, which I think is really important to think of a city being liberated in a sense by partly African-American soldiers as well. And the people were jubilant, were obviously very, very happy. African-Americans were very, very happy. They began to celebrate, but there were also stories about them being punished for celebrating. In one town, people who were celebrating, they were sort of gathered up and whipped. There were whites who refused to accept this. One of the interesting things about Granger's order is that he says essentially that there will be equality. You now exist in a state of equality, and you are to be seen as an employee, which is a pretty bold thing to say, to talk about equality in there. He could have just said, you're free and just left it at that. But to add that obviously made the enslaved people happy, but it incensed a number of whites who heard this, because this was the nightmare that they had hoped would not happen. And they turned to violence. Violence was widespread throughout Texas during that time period. I mean, Eric Foner's book Reconstruction paints the really grim picture of it. I remember one thing about a person coming into a town and seeing about 30 bodies hanging from trees, men, women, and children, bodies in the river, people had been killed. So it was a time of celebration, but it was also a time of violence and retaliation on the part of people who had lost their property interest in people. Then there was a period of Reconstruction where there were Black legislators. There were people who held office. One of the cool things that I found was my great-great-grandfather's voter registration. This was in 1867. Now, Blacks were not given the right to vote. They didn't affirm that until 1869. This is a mystery for me. I'd like to know what the heck was happening with that. But you know this, in these little towns, there are laws, but on the ground, people do all different kinds of things. So it would be interesting to me to find out how he managed what was going on with that. And then, of course, it all shuts down when Reconstruction is done, certainly by 1877 when it's totally done, and they remove the troops from all of the South, and we get Redeemer governments and Jim Crow and lynching and all of the things that we know happened up until the moment we began to get the Second American Revolution and the Civil Rights era. And then I began the book talking about integrating my town's schools when I went to the first grade. So I started with that and sort of go backwards in time to talk about how we got to that particular point where we were still fighting for the rights of African American people in Texas in the 1960s.
Do we have a number of how many enslaved people were in Texas when Granger gave his General Order Number 3?
I think there were over 800,000. That was the tally that I remember. So, Texas was not like South Carolina or anything like that, but there's still a good number of people.
Now, just a few moments ago, you were telling us how jubilant the Black population of Texas was on hearing about Granger's General Order Number 3, which freed all enslaved people in Texas. And I wonder, given that On Juneteenth is such a personal story for you and the ways that you wove your story into the history that you tell us about, were you able to find any information about how your ancestors may have reacted to Granger's June 19, 1865 order?
Not directly. I do recall, and I talk about this actually in an essay that I did for the New Yorker, talking to my great-grandmother about it. And I remember sitting with her saying, it didn't seem that people took this very seriously, that this was a big deal. And she said it was a big deal for us. Her mother had been born enslaved and had been freed by her father when she was a little girl, along with her mother. So she knew somebody who had been enslaved. And in fact, her mother, who'd had 3 husbands who died, and the third one she had been enslaved until the end of the Civil War. So he was a slave. So my grandmother, my great-grandmother, actually my mother knew this man too. Slavery was pretty close, So I just recall her saying how much the day meant for her. Now, she wouldn't have experienced the original one, but she knew how much it meant to people, and they continued to celebrate it, all the time until I left home, pretty much. It was a big deal for us to get together and celebrate.
I'm really glad you brought up celebrations and the meaning of Juneteenth, because we have several listener questions about the Juneteenth holiday.
Mm-hmm.
So first, Susan would like to know when and how the Juneteenth Proclamation, Granger's General Order Number 3, was received in different parts of Texas. She notes that Texas is a huge state, so she wonders what the process of freeing enslaved people looked like across this large state and its many different regions.
It was a patchwork of things. As I'd indicated before, there were some former enslavers who just refused to do it, and with violence were holding people hostage. Now, the army could interfere with that to some degree. Other people complied with it. It was word of mouth, the way things traveled during slavery, always. People traveling from one town to the next or whatever. It was in newspapers, obviously, and you could overhear people talking about it, but it was sort of a mixed bag because it took a lot for some people, some whites, to accept it. And once the Freedmen's Bureau was put in place in Texas, they started working with enslaved people and whites to make sure contracts were fair, that they actually had contracts to work and so forth. So it was a patchwork. It was just sort of a gradual process of this thing unfolding with some backlash, as I said.
Was this a proclamation that the Union Army enforced by going from town to town and trying to free enslaved people? Or did they really just leave it up to the Freedmen's Bureau and an honor type system where they relied on slaveholders to free their enslaved people?
No, I don't think they went town to town to free enslaved people. There were not enough of them to do that all over Texas, even all over East Texas. It was a big place. What I'm able to discern, it was in the areas immediately around Galveston and Houston, and in those places where the Union Army was, they did say this, but to my knowledge, not forcing anybody to free people. But it was reported in newspapers everywhere, and the surrender of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi meant that the Confederates had lost, and some people abided by that. Most people abided by that, but some did not, and it took a while.
You mentioned that there was both a lot of celebration about Juneteenth, and a lot of backlash. And Maria would like to know how people in Texas celebrated and celebrate Juneteenth. So Annette, could you tell us about the history and evolution of Juneteenth celebrations?
Well, first it was called Emancipation Day. Juneteenth comes, I haven't been able to figure out precisely when that comes into the vernacular and it becomes the thing that people call it. Originally, Emancipation Day celebrations in churches at first, on church grounds, and then gradually, in the 1870s, some Black men got together and bought land in Houston and called it Emancipation Park. And it was for the express purpose of celebrating Juneteenth. And over the years, at some point, the city bought it, and then it became, in Jim Crow era, a park for Black people. And so then the tradition in this area was to have them in parks, and that spread. So you could have Juneteenth celebrations in churches or in local parks, local Black parks during Jim Crow. And that was the practice then. We had food, certain kinds of food. For some reason, and I mentioned this in the New Yorker article and this one, barbecued goat became associated with Juneteenth. And that was not a big thing in our family, but there would be a barbecued goat and red soda water, as we called it. Soda water, meaning pop or Coke. In Texas, we call everything a Coke. But red soda water and sort of traditional Southern fare. So there were things that you ate and church and celebrations. The thing is, when I was growing up, because it's in June and we weren't in school in June in Texas, it was just a great holiday to get together with the family and have firecrackers and sparklers and all those kinds of things and just drink a lot of soda water.
Your descriptions of Juneteenth sound a lot like 4th of July celebrations. Barbecues, time with family, firecrackers and sparklers, lots of soda.
Mm-hmm. And growing up, Texas made Juneteenth a state holiday, I think in the 90s. And then everybody celebrated it. I don't recall white people celebrating Juneteenth when I was a little girl, but it was sort of the July 4th for Black people. Although we celebrated July 4th as well, this sort of a 1-2 punch to have Juneteenth celebration and then come back in July 4th and do similar kinds of things. But yeah, I always like the idea of them playing off one another because obviously the Declaration and July 4th and all men are created equal, the paradox that people were enslaved when that was said. But Juneteenth, and again, looking at Granger's proclamation, who references equality in it, I think ties the documents together.
Now, Mark notes that Juneteenth is starting to become commemorated outside of Texas. In fact, as of 2019, all but 4 states have recognized Juneteenth as a commemorative day, and many states like Virginia and Massachusetts are now celebrating Juneteenth as a state holiday.
Mm-hmm.
So, Annette, Mark would like to know your thoughts on the growing adoption of Juneteenth as a holiday. And Betsy would like to know why you think so many states are adopting Juneteenth and starting to honor this Texas state holiday.
Well, I start the book saying that I was a little miffed about that at the beginning. I felt the first time I heard other people celebrating it outside of Texas, I was thinking, what does this have to do with other people? But now I embrace the idea of other people celebrating it because I think it's important. I think because we don't really have a day to commemorate the end of slavery, and we know that that wasn't the total end of slavery. Slavery legally ends December 1865 when the 13th Amendment is finally ratified. And I think people want to commemorate it. They want to have something to hold on to. Now, there are other days that people suggest. January 1st, Emancipation Proclamation. But January already has a holiday. And you run the risk of having something that nobody's paying attention to. And I think it's a nice time of year. Do we have another holiday in June? I don't think so. Nothing there. So it fits. It works well. And I think people do want to commemorate a time to think about enslaved people because we know that there were still problems. God knows there were still problems after the end of slavery, but this meant a lot to the people who lived in slavery. And there ought to be some way of recognizing that feeling, that moment of joy that they had about that and the moment of hope that they had growing out of it. So I think people want to do that and they want a part of that. And it's Juneteenth sounds cool. It works.
And for those of us who are uninitiated. We've never celebrated Juneteenth before. Do you have any tips or things that you think we should be doing or thinking about as we celebrate Juneteenth this year?
Well, I think read some history books, read about it, talk to your children about it, treat it as a family day. Think of your family, because in working as a scholar of slavery, I'm continually struck by how, and not surprising, how painful it was for people to lose family members to slavery, to sale and separation. So I would just like for people to think about those individuals who lived under that system. Try to find out something about them, about their lives, think about their lives, reflect on family and the importance of it and how they were deprived of it in far too many instances. Just try to have some empathy for that, to think about that and what a horrible thing it was.
Thank you for that advice. And I'm glad we have your ideas about this, because it does seem like Juneteenth is gaining momentum towards becoming a federal holiday. So, Annette, if Juneteenth is made a federal holiday, what do you think that means for our understandings and views of early American history and early United States history?
Well, I think it'll be a time to stop and think about this institution that helped build the country, and it's interesting that we don't really have that much. I mean, we have, I suppose people think of Martin Luther King's birthday as a day to think about the civil rights movement and so forth. But I think it will focus attention on the institution, and that should happen. I mean, we're doing it more and more now. It's not like when I was growing up. Obviously, there's history books about slavery abound and television shows, all kinds of things. But a national day to commemorate those people, the people who lived under that, I think would be good for Americans, for us all. And I think it might happen. I hope it happens. I know that there are lots of people who are working on that, and there are people who have different days that they want, and we'll have to see which one makes the most sense. But I think that this is a good choice.
And from here, we should jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
Oh, gosh.
We've talked a lot about Texas today and the state's connections with slavery. And since we also talked about Texas as an independent republic, we're curious. In your opinion, what might have happened if Texas had remained an independent republic? How would the course of early American and United States history be different?
Well, chances are slavery would have lasted a longer time in Texas because they would have escaped the Civil War. But on the other hand, if the North still had won, had been victorious, enslaved people in Texas would constantly be running north and running south. It would be a place in constant turmoil. And slavery would have lasted longer, dwindling down maybe to domestic enslaved people working in the house, things of that nature. Maybe, mechanization, the technology would have changed so that you could have had other ways than having people in the fields to do things. But slavery would have lasted longer because the Republic would have kept it. They have fertile soil. They had a great port. They could have continued on by themselves for a while, I think. So it may be in the 20th century or something. But with more territory to run to, it would have been a constantly roiled society, I would imagine.
Now, I think the last time we spoke, you mentioned that you were working on a biography project of William Lloyd Garrison. Am I remembering that right?
No, Garrison probably came up, but I wasn't doing. What I'm working on now is another volume of the Hemmings family story. Volume 2 of that will not be as long as the first one, not as many people to cover, but that's what I'm working on.
And where's a good place to contact you if we have more questions about slavery, Thomas Jefferson, or Juneteenth?
Harvard. My email, go on Google, and my email is there. Or Twitter. I'm on Twitter. I answer questions on Twitter.
Annette Gordon-Reed, thank you for taking the time to join us again and for helping us better understand Juneteenth and Texas's history with slavery.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Juneteenth is a holiday that commemorates June 19, 1865, the day Union Army General Gordon Granger issued General Order No. 3, an order that abolished slavery in the state of Texas and declared the equality of African Americans with white people. Now, although Texas wasn't the largest slaveholding state, the end of slavery in Texas was a big deal. As Annette revealed, Texas had a long history with slavery, a history that dates back to the 16th century when Estebanico, an enslaved man of African descent, accompanied a group of Spanish explorers as they made their way from around Tampa Bay, Florida, to Texas. Along the way, Estebanico proved his talent for languages, and he served as the translator between the Spanish and the native peoples they encountered. What these explorers found in Texas were lush lands. The eastern part of Texas contains forests of trees and prime lands for cultivation. Plus, along the Gulf Coast region, which also has great agricultural lands, there's a great port for trade at Galveston. These lush and fertile lands for agriculture and timber mining, plus the great port at Galveston, are the main reasons why many Anglo-Americans chose to move to this Spanish and later Mexican-controlled region. Now, the Anglo-American migration to Texas really picked up steam in 1825, when Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas, encouraged 300 families to relocate to this Mexican state. The use of enslaved people to clear the land of timber and to do the hard labor of cotton and sugar cultivation proved vital for the establishment of Anglo-American settlement in Texas. As Annette told us, Anglo-Americans imagined Texas as a slave colony, a place that protected the institution of slavery and held up and celebrated white supremacy within its culture, which is in part what made General Granger's General Order No. 3 a really big deal in Texas. Not only did General Order No. 3 abolish slavery in Texas, it also promised to upend white supremacy in the state by declaring equality between blacks and whites. Now, as Annette covers in her book On Juneteenth, bringing about equality in Texas and in most areas of the United States has been a long journey and one we're still traveling, which is why Annette and many others are excited to see Juneteenth rise in prominence, from an African American day of commemoration to a state holiday in Texas, to a state holiday outside of Texas, and perhaps one day it will even become a national day of commemoration throughout the United States. A day when all Americans can remember and think about the institution of slavery and revel in its abolishment. You'll find more information about Annette, her book On Juneteenth, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/304. Today's episode was brought to you by BetterHelp. Start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll receive 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/benfranklin. Join over 1 million people who have taken charge of their mental health. Visit betterhelp.com/benfranklin. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, are there other holidays that you'd like to explore the history of? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.